Welcome, fellow folklorians. All right, this is a word I just made up. We're just giving it a try. This is Fabric of Folklore, and I'm your host, Vanessa Y. Rogers. This podcast is striving to understand our history and therefore better understand ourselves through the lens of folklore. We do this by interviewing really interesting guests each week, such as authors, historians, folklorists, anthropologists, musicians, artists. It's going to be a wild ride, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. You are not going to want to miss our guest today. His name is John Kruse, and he was born in South Yorkshire, which is in England, for those of us not in Britain. He studied and written about British folklore and particularly in British fairy lore. The topics range across fairy lore, the Arthurian cycle, English and Celtic myth, and folk customs. And he's written books in both fiction and nonfiction dealing with these themes. So in total, he's written 48 books, but they are across a range of subjects and styles. So welcome, John. I'm so glad to have you today.
Okay.
And my first question is, I'm just exhausted reading your resume. Do you ever sleep?
I do, yes. I've been concentrating on the books for the last 6-7 years now, and a lot of the fairy books were written in the last couple of years when we were in lockdown here in Britain. So there was, I'd gathered lots of material together, so it was an ideal time to actually pull all those bits of information together into a range of detailed books on the subject. So, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of obsession in a way that I like to put things down on paper and get them out.
Well, we're so glad that you are, because it's such a fascinating topic. But before we get into the fairy lore, because obviously it's very fascinating, I really want to understand you better and how all of your interests tie together. Because when I went onto your website, your interests include law, mythology, history, art, poetry, cinema, and music as well. And I just kind of want to see how that journey has happened to get you here today.
Well, obviously the law side doesn't have a great deal to do with what we're going to be talking about today, other than maybe just that the habit I got out of researching those books of just wanting to get back to the original source of a piece of information. So, if I was dealing with, particularly the law I was dealing with here in England was, it was to do with bailiffs, and that hadn't been reformed at all when I first got involved with it. So it was all case law going right back to the early Middle Ages.
Interesting.
And I wanted to read the original cases, so I knew what people had actually said rather than a second-hand kind of version of that. And I think that idea carried over into the fairy lore work that I've done. That, again, a lot of books are based on somebody else's book, and I always wanted to try to go back to the original source whenever I could get hold of it. And I live in London, and luckily just down the tube line from our house is the British Library, so I could go and look at a lot of the original books. And a lot are online anyway these days. So yeah, I suppose that habit of trying to go back to the very first word that was written about it has carried over from the sort of very boring and serious area of law into something a bit more interesting. And I'd done 30 years of dealing with the law, and I was a bit sick of it, and it was nice to have a change as well, to be honest.
Well, I am interested in hearing if was any like antiquated law that came up in your research when you were seeing all the medieval laws that haven't changed at all? Was there anything that was super interesting that popped up?
Well, it was all technical stuff to do with English enforcement. But I mean, it was just what grabbed me in a way was the fact that the earliest Act of Parliament that I was dealing with was a thing called the Statute of Marlborough from 1267, I think it was, and it was still in force and it hadn't been changed. And that was just a sort of ridiculous situation that I come from a background of advising people who were in debt and who were being pursued by bailiffs. And the idea that in the 20th century, you could be chased by bailiffs using law that had been developed in the 13th century was just ridiculous because, circumstances had changed so much. Not just, I suppose, the legal system, but, the way people live and the possessions people have. So trying to carry over medieval ideas into modern circumstances was just ridiculous. So that was part of the challenge. Just to say, British Parliament has updated the law now, and it is a lot better than it used to be.
That's great. All right. So how did you get into fairy lore? What took you on that journey?
I think it was back when I was still in my teens. I started to get interested in the stories of King Arthur, like you were saying, and probably after I went to university, I started to probably read a bit more maturely and sophisticatedly about that. And I was, again, reading about King Arthur led me to, like you said, the Celtic myths and the Irish myths and Welsh myths and so on. And one thing led to another. And, if you're reading a lot of the stories about King Arthur, you've got Morgan Le Fay, who is, a sort of fairy character. And inevitably, you're going to end up sort of coming across fairies on a regular basis. And I probably about, 1981, 82, I bought my first book about fairies. And for a couple of years, I was really interested in it. And I managed to pick up some of the kind of the classic books on the subject. And then probably for 30 years, I didn't really think about it again. They were still there on my bookshelf, but I hadn't really looked at the subject particularly closely. I got interested in other things completely, like you were saying, sort of poetry and music and other stuff. But then back in early 2016, I had a period when my health wasn't particularly good, and I just happened to pick up a book I'd bought back then, which I don't think I'd read properly, and I started reading that again, and it just sort of clicked, and I thought, I'd like to do something with this. I'd like to restart this interest because it's always been there, kind of in the back of my mind. But I thought I could do something.
Do you know what it was about that book that grabbed you?
I think it was a book, but there's a very famous English author on the subject whose second name it's on the shelf behind me. Her second name is going to completely desert me at the moment, but it was called the Fairies in British tradition and literature. And it was partly that idea that there were the stories that had been collected, but then there was the way that it flowed across into poetry and into plays and into novels and into music as well. And that idea that it was quite a sort of major cultural influence in a way, that so much of British culture has sort of built on fairy stories in one way or another. I think that was what kind of excited me.
And
there was
where do you
more
see
than
that?
just the fairies to talk about.
Where do you see that? How British society is built on fairy lore?
Well, I mean, a very simple example is William Shakespeare. Obviously, so many of the really favourite plays. Obviously, Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Merry Wives of Windsor, and bits and pieces in other plays by him, and also equally in other plays from that period. The fairies are sort of there as just kind of a fact of life, which everybody took for granted and everybody understood. And they started from that basis and then developed the stories from that. Coming into Victorian times, there was a real boom in poetry, and particularly poetry based on fairy stories, and not just in this country. I mean, lots of poets in the States as well were picking up on fairy themes as well, and it became very, very significant in British art at that time. Partly the pre-Raphaelites, which everybody knows, but there was a whole kind of school of British fairy painting too. So, yeah, I think it's something that's quite underestimated by people in a way, how significant a theme it's been.
Do we know how far back the fairy stories go? Like, when do we have any idea of when the first fairy story was told, or what group of people were originally telling the fairy stories?
Well, you can. My blog, British Fairies, on WordPress. I've got followers from all over the world, and a man from Vermont was in touch with me in the last week, saying, "Well, my family originally came from Suffolk in the east of England, and did I know what the sort of fairy lore was there?" And I said to him, "Well, some of the very earliest British fairy stories come from Suffolk. There's a story about the green children from a village called Woolpit in East Anglia, which is dated to the early 1200s. And there's a couple of other stories from Suffolk from about that time. So you've certainly got fairies as we still recognise them today from not that long after the Norman conquest. And you go the other side of that back into Anglo-Saxon times, then they called them elves, but there were still definitely elves that bear a very, very close resemblance to what we call fairies today. So I think you could probably go back right to the Anglo-Saxons arriving in this country and say, well, they were dealing with fairies as we'd recognise them. And then, separately from that, you've got all the fairy stories in Wales and the fairy stories in the north of Scotland where people speak Gaelic, which again are fed into our modern idea of fairies. So my argument would be, well, they've been here since the start, really. As long as there's been people in the British Isles, then they've been dealing with the fairies that live in the British Isles.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that it's been here from the start? Well,
I suppose that can maybe come down to terminology, and I tend to not say I wouldn't say I'm a folklorist, because that tends to be a bit more of a, I haven't got a qualification in that area. I'm not an academic folklorist. I'd say I'm a fairy lorist, if they're, again, inventing a word. And I'd say my approach is very much to take the attitude, well, people have been telling these stories based on their personal experiences for several thousand years, So my approach in all the books I've written is not so much to sort of say, oh, that's an interesting story, and then try to analyze why it is that people would think such odd things and what the sort of rational explanations of that might be. My approach in all the books I've done is to sort of say, well, okay, these people saw this this person and they had an interaction with this person, and we should take that seriously, and we should accept that there is kind of living in parallel to the British population. There is this other British population, a supernatural population, which has always been here. So that's how I've approached it, and I've just decided to pay the witnesses the compliment of taking them seriously, and of saying, well, that's what you saw, that's what you felt. I'm not going to question that, and therefore to explain it all on that basis, that the fundamental basis, well, the fairies exist, and we'll work from that point.
Yeah. There was also you wrote a book called "The Fairy Faith in British Music."
Yes,
and it examines how fairies have influenced different musical styles. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose that does again go back to to when I was in my teens. Because I was growing up I was born in 1960, so I was entering my teens in the early 70s, and one of the first bands that I listened to was Led Zeppelin, and inevitably one of the first songs that I really got excited about was Stairway to Heaven. And I've always been quite attached to that song, and I see that as really an archetypal kind of fairy song. Really, I mean, they're taking some of those key ideas of British folklore, and they're turning it into a rock song. But it's a fairy tune, I'd say. And there's those.
I can't recall any of the lyrics. What lyrics are you referring to? I mean, do you remember any of the lyrics?
Well, that stuff about the spring cleaning your hedgerow and so on, the May Queen. There's this idea of her being a kind of some sort of nature goddess of some description.
Okay.
The whole kind of, it's not so much the word, what the story is telling. It's just I suppose the aura of it is quite supernatural and quite magical, I would say. And you could maybe put different labels on it. And Robert Graves talked about the white goddess and this sort of this nature goddess, and that's one way of looking at it. But you could equally look at her as being a fairy queen. And that's there's obviously a section in the book discussing Stairway to Heaven, but again, back in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, Mark Bolan and T-Rex were very much into, before he became the glam star that everybody remembers, a lot of the stuff that he was writing, again, was very kind of magic and myth and fairy orientated. It's been there through British classical music, and then into British rock music for certainly all of the 20th century. And then, as I say in the fairy faith in British music, it slightly expands from that point, because in the last I suppose 30 or 40 years, and particularly in the last 20 years, I think, because of the Lord of the Rings films, then there's an incredibly sort of strong element in various forms of heavy metal now, which is all kind of Tolkien and elves and goblins, and there's bands out there that records albums entirely in Elvish or in Orcish or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And they there's a whole kind of subgenre of rock music which is entirely built on on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien.
How interesting. I had no idea. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean it's become quite cliched in those circles. I think that there's, but at the same time, it's an incredible inspiration for people, and there's people out there writing entire kind of operas, sort of death metal operas based on the works of Tolkien, and it's still going. It's got extra impetus from the Peter Jackson films coming out, but it predates that. Again, in the mid-70s, I think one of the first albums was a Danish musician produced an album based on Lord of the Rings, I think it was.
Okay.
And you may not know him so well in the States, but Sir Cliff Richard, one of the kind of great figures of British music, if not contemporary British music. Sir Cliff Richard, incredibly, even recorded a song about Galadriel back in the mid-70s, which I was quite stunned to discover, because it's not really what you associate at all with him, but it just was such a strong element around then, and it hasn't really sort of lessened since. I don't think it's maybe become a bit more niche, but it's still very, very relevant to lots of metal musicians, definitely.
That's fascinating that metal music would pick up the fairy lore.
Well, I think it's not the fairy lore that I write about. It's very much the fairies as reimagined by Tolkien.
Right.
So it's all about kind of vast battles between armies of orcs and armies of elves and dwarves and that kind of thing. It's not your much more sort of domestic and rural kind of fairy that is mostly what I'm spending my time talking about.
But you do have a book that's called The Darker Side of Fairies that does kind of look at that, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think that's another. I think that's probably another motivation why I did want to write the number of books that I've written, because there is obviously a very strong popular kind of idea of fairies as being very nice and quite girly. And probably most suited to little girls, and if you say fairy to a lot of people, then they'll just think of Tinkerbell, and they'll think of little girls dressed up in pink tutus with wings and a tiara and a wand and that kind of thing. And that's something which developed in British culture and worldwide culture, I guess, sort of from the early 20th century onwards, but it's not what British folklore, British fairy lore is about. And really, that's why I created the blog on British fairies, and that's why the first book I wrote was about British fairies, and it's a theme I stress throughout all the things that I've written, but particularly in The Darker Side of Fairies, that if you go back to the actual folklore and you look what people have said about fairies over the last few centuries, they're not very nice people. They're not very friendly a lot of the time. They can be quite cruel. They can be quite selfish.
Can you give us an example of like a short story or of a cruel or unkind fairy?
A fairly sort of common Well, they like to tease people, and they can be quite cruel to humans
Mhm.
a lot of the time, and that tends to to manifest itself in various forms of kidnapping. For example, like people may be taken just to act as servants for the fairies, and it's quite common
Oh.
for particularly children to be taken to work in their kitchens and to do all the menial chores and so on. Women may be taken perhaps just after they've had a child because they want the new mother to wet nurse a fairy child,
Mhm.
or they may take young women in order to have babies with them. Um, or
Mm.
alternatively, the other very common theme is I don't know if you've heard of changelings, uh,
Yes.
and the changeling idea is that they will take your baby for whatever purpose, and they will leave instead an elderly fairy in the cradle that looks like a bit like the child that's been taken,
Mhm.
but is a few hundred years old in reality. And
Mhm.
I think that's serving two purposes for the fairies. On the one hand, they're sort of getting fresh blood into the fairy race by
Mhm.
bringing this child up as a fairy in the fairy community. And at the same time, I think cynically, they're saving on all the costs of looking after an elderly person in their community. They just dump him on the humans instead, and the humans have to take care of this very demanding child that never really grows up and just sort of lies in its cot and has to be fed and has to be washed and all of that.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, there's that very kind of harsh and calculating attitude towards humans, that we're kind of there to be used, really. And clearly, taking people's children is incredibly cruel, but the fairies don't
Right.
really care about that.
Yeah.
It serves their interests, so they'll do it. They're able to do it because they've got the magical powers, and they don't have any qualms about how that's going to affect the victims. So, yeah, I mean, when you look at it, the relationship between the human population and the fairy population, a lot of the time, is quite tense and quite nasty, really. I mean, there
Mhm.
is intermarriage, and
Mhm.
there's quite a strong tradition of people taking. Um, Typically, it's men taking fairy brides, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Mhm.
So we can get on and we can successfully have children together. But a lot of the stories are much more violent, and like the title of the book, they're a lot darker, really.
Mhm.
And a lot of the folklore that exists is different ways of protecting yourself from the fairies, so that they can't steal your food and they can't steal your possessions and they can't steal members of your family.
So what are things that people would do to protect themselves from the fairies?
There's a whole range of kind of different magical procedures that people will use. And sort of Christian symbolism is used quite a lot. So people will um, they'll maybe carry a page of the Bible around with them, or a page of a prayer book,
Mhm.
or they'll have obviously a cross on them, or maybe if they think that they're in the presence of a fairy or they're suffering a fairy attack, then they may just bless themselves or something like that. But
Mhm.
there's also much older kind of stuff which is nothing to do with Christianity. So the fairies don't like iron. So if you people would often walk around maybe just with a pin pushed into, say, the lapel of their coat or something like that, because just that little bit of metal on you would be a protection. Or they'd have a knife with them, something like that. Or various sorts of wood will protect you from the fairies. So a cross made out of the rowan tree, mountain ash, is a very good protection. And then really odd things like, particularly in the Highlands in Scotland, one way of protecting the family would be to set fire to an old shoe. Now, I don't really know why that works, other than probably it smells terrible. But there's a whole range of different kind of practical tricks like that, which will defend your house or the individual themselves from a fairy attack of some description. So,
Interesting.
big part of the folklore is all the things that you can do to avoid the fairies rather than to encounter them. And nowadays, a lot of the stuff you see online is ways of making contact with fairies and ways of becoming friendly with the fairies. And I think lots of British people from 200 years ago and further back really wouldn't understand why anybody would want to do that, because they'd think it was just a really, really strange sort of idea.
But our perception of fairies has changed quite a bit, so that probably feeds into that. Yeah,
definitely. But I think what's changed those perceptions is not particularly based on the folklore. It's come out of fiction. I think if you want to start to find anybody to blame, particularly, I'd say the woman who designed the flower fairies back in the 1920s is probably one of the culprits, because that started this idea that fairies were very very harmless, very pretty, very small, and they were sort of dainty and pleasant and suitable material for children to find out about, and that was a pleasant idea that she had, but it wasn't really based on any sort of solid folklore basis. And I think that does give people quite a misleading idea of what most of the actual folklore has to say about these things. And I think there's some people who don't like to be told that, but that's, I suppose, part of the if you like, to give it a very grand term, the sort of mission that I've been on for the last few years is just, like I said right at the start, going back to those original sources and saying, well, this is actually what it says. Like it or not.
Well, do you have a favorite fairy story that particularly stands out to you?
Well, I think one of the ones that has always stuck in my mind is that the one I mentioned a while ago, the Green Children from Woolpit in Suffolk, which is one of those very earliest stories, but it's one of the most, I think it's one of the most sort of intriguing in a way, that it was kind of harvest time, the end of the summer, back in the early 1200s, and suddenly in this village, these two children who were completely green appeared, and they couldn't speak English, and the only thing that they would eat was peas, fresh peas that they were offered, and nobody knew where they'd come from, obviously, because nobody could understand, and it took some time for people to be able to communicate with them. And what they said was that they lived in a kind of underground country, which they called, well, it was called by the people who recorded it, St. Martin's Land. And it wasn't sunny there, but it wasn't dark either. It was just this continual sort of twilight. One day they'd been out, I forget, maybe looking after their sheep or something like that, and they'd seen light in the distance, and they'd heard noise in the distance, and they'd followed that, and they'd gone along long passages, and then suddenly come out into the open air, and they were just stunned by the brightness and by the heat. And then people working in the fields found them and took them away, so they were unable to sort of find their way back to the entrance to the underworld. And they stayed living in the human world in Suffolk then. The boy, there were two of them, there was a girl and a boy, and the boy didn't last that long, but the girl stayed in the human community, and she grew up, and she married a local man, and presumably, somewhere there are still people who are descended from one of these green children. And interestingly, one of the things that they said about her was that, yeah, she did get married, but I think that until she got married, she was quite shocking to a lot of the people of the time, because she was quite promiscuous, and she'd have lots of boyfriends, and she'd sleep with lots of people, which was disapproved of then, and maybe doesn't again really fit in with our almost quite asexual view of fairies today. But again, the folklore and a lot of the stuff from the Middle Ages, that's what the fairies are like, really. They're quite sort of liberated in their attitudes, and they're not very faithful. And they did have quite a reputation. So that aspect of that story did fit in with the broader kind of ideas about their morality and their behavior. So yeah, it's a story where you've got a lot of people who experienced it. A number of people working in the field found these children, and then they were taken to the local lord of the manor, and I think they lived in his household. So you got dozens of people who came into contact with them just in the local manor house and the local community, and then this girl stayed living there for the rest of her life. So you can't say, oh well, it was just made up by an individual person, or maybe it was just some funny experience that a person with a mental health problem had.
Did her coloring remain green? Did they mention her?
It faded as they ate more human food, and I think that maybe the longer they were there in the full daylight, then they became, they were no longer green coloured. Fortunately, really.
How fascinating! Well, on your blog, one of the things that you post is that you say that with your blog you wanted to ask, you're trying to get at three main questions, and I kind of wanted to ask those questions back at you. The first was, how did such a highly structured alternative universe come to be imagined by previous generations?
Well, I think probably that particular question I wrote maybe when I first started the blog, and that's probably now I'd feel that was a bit more of a folklorist question than a fairy lorist question, if you like. And I think I was I was probably being a little bit hesitant in my commitment to the fairies at that point, and as I said, I think the over the last 6 years, the more time I've spent sort of dealing with it, then the more I've I think my feeling has always been, well, lots and lots of people have had these experiences, and I think we should take them at face value. Unless we've had lots of mass hallucinations, or we've had person after person having the same sort of mental delusion, then the consistency of it and the constancy of it has brought me around to saying, well, it's not something that they've imagined so much as something that actually happened to them, and and as I said, we'll start from that basis. We'll believe them, and we'll treat them seriously. And so, I suppose, I mean, for example, I've written a little book called on the fairy life cycle, and that is my original title, which the publisher didn't like, was I called it A Fairy Anatomy. And it was very. What the book does is say, oh, okay, well, this is a description of kind of physical description of fairy physiology, what they eat, what they drink, how long they live, how their body works, that kind of thing, and just treating it as it's a biological study of fairies, if you like.
And how long do they live?
A long time. They can. I mean, some people think that they're immortal, but I think the evidence is that they'll live quite a few hundred years, but they will eventually die, and they can be killed. And occasionally, people do kill them. There are a few stories where humans have actually killed fairies, so they're not invincible. Definitely, they can be got rid of if you're really determined to do it. But most of the time, people are maybe a bit too cautious to do anything so extreme.
Okay, so I'm going to skip the second question because I think you kind of answered that one. The third one that you posted was, what is the ongoing impact of those beliefs?
Well, that's a big one, I think.
Right.
Because I think there is that, like we were talking about before, there is that cultural impact that is still there as a theme feeding through in popular music. It's still there as something which motivates art. So if you look online, there's still people creating pictures of fairies and elves and so on. So it's still something which people see as a very vital source of inspiration, and it's still something that people want to write about. I've written a couple of stories, and lots of other people are drawn to writing about that subject as well. So, as a source of art and literature and film, I mean, recently on Netflix, we watched an Icelandic series called Katla, which was about changelings. And there was a Swedish one called Elves that was available, which was released, I think, sort of during the autumn sometime. Where a family find that where they're staying is infested with elves, I think. So, things which are being produced now, and obviously are seen as having a market, are coming from fairy inspiration. So it's still something that is significant to a lot of people. And then on the sort of the factual side, well, people are still seeing the fairies on a regular basis. I'm a member of a sort of very loose group of people called the Fairy Investigation Society here. And the person who coordinates that, a man called Simon Young, he does a regular fairy census, which just collects people's fairy experiences from all over the world. And he's constantly getting reports of encounters coming in. So, again, it's not something which is embalmed in old books in the British Library. It's something which is still. What
are some examples of experiences people are reporting?
I mean, one interesting thing is, I think the way people see things it would appear, is to a certain extent shaped by their preconceptions, or maybe by their language anyway. So, when they're asked to give a description of what they saw, they will reach for the most familiar terms, and quite often you get people saying, "Well, it looked like Gollum," or
Mm-hmm.
"It looked like Legolas," or whatever, or or it looked. Tinkerbell is a very, very common one, and I don't know if you know, but the original stage play of Peter Pan, because the Victorian the Victorian theatre couldn't really cope with having a fairy
Female.
sort of flying around the auditorium, they just used a light, and
Oh, right.
Tinkerbell in the original production was just a light that flashed around on stage, and quite a lot of people do report their fairy experience of being a light, or lights even, that are maybe they see in the bushes in their garden, or in a forest or something like that. So certainly a lot of the ways that people try to put their experience into words are borrowing from popular films and popular fiction and that kind of thing. But there's a range of experiences. People will maybe just catch sight of these little lights in the trees, or they will have much more face-to-face experiences. There's been hundreds of them reported, but one particularly unpleasant one, I think, was from, I think it was Australia. The woman had the experience of her house was invaded by, I suppose, again, what we'd call dwarves or gnomes or something like that, and they actually took her prisoner, and they kind of they tied her up, and they pinned her down in her room so that she couldn't move at all, and she was trapped for hours by these small creatures. I can't, obviously she eventually managed to escape. I can't quite remember how it came about, but again, it wasn't a friendly, and it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. It was very, very scary for her, and their motivation was clearly not at all benign towards her. They wanted to do her harm. There was no question about that. Yeah, and people will see really, really strange things as well, things which don't fit in with anybody's really particularly standard vision of what a fairy is. But there have been quite a few reports of what are essentially, again, going back to Tolkien, probably what we call ents, of walking tree-like beings. But again, the fairy census has produced several of those, where people have seen these moving bushes or moving trees, and it's very difficult to explain it. But again, they're not. It isn't just one isolated sighting. There have been at least half a dozen, I think. So, yeah, it's a fascinating area. It's a still developing area.
Well, we don't have a whole lot more time with you, but I did want to have you talk a little bit about how fairies are seen often today as protectors of the forest. And I think you have a book about that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did one on fairies in the natural world, partly in response, I think, to that, or this prevailing idea that fairies are, if you like, eco-guardians, and their primary purpose for making contact with us is because they're concerned about the climate crisis, and they're concerned about environmental degradation, and they want to work with us to do something about that. And that's a theme which has come out quite strongly in a number of books since probably the 1920s. There was a man called Rock. ROC was his abbreviation. I can't remember his first name, but he was somebody or other Campbell, and he had an encounter with a faun, which isn't a fairy at all, in a park in Edinburgh, and the reason for making contact with him was to say to him, well, we need you to pay attention to the natural world and do something about this, which was quite advanced, I guess, in the 1920s, when hardly anybody thought about that. But yeah, that theme has come more and more to the fore. And again, if you go back, as I've done in the British folklore, then it's hard really to trace any real traditional origin for that. Because surprisingly, again, the British fairies, as people have seen them over the centuries, are not particularly environmental kind of characters. They farm. And they mine, and there's a whole family of fairies called the Knockers who people encountered down mainly tin and lead mines and that kind of thing, and they are extracting minerals from under the ground just like humans are. So a lot of their activities are not very environmental and not very green at all. And again, I think partly that trend in modern literature has come out of the Victorian period, when again there was a tendency to make fairies quite small and quite child friendly, and to say, oh well, they live in flowers and they're associated with flowers, and I think from that original idea that they live in the countryside and they like to play with birds and flutter around pretty flowers. That's kind of expanded into this more kind of eco-guardian view of the fairies. But as I said, it's hard to really find any traditional basis for that. They live in the countryside on the whole, and they're obviously much more attuned to the environment than humans are, and they make much more use of natural products than humans do now, and they're maybe associated particularly with certain trees. But it's really quite difficult to push it beyond that and say that they're really a very green sort of community of people.
All right. Well, what are you working on now, and where can people find your work?
Well, the next book to come out is most of the books that I've done in the last couple of years have been with a little publisher in the west of England called Green Magic. They're based near Glastonbury, of course, and the latest book coming out with Green Magic is due quite soon, and it's about Welsh fairies. And that because Wales is quite a small country, I thought it was a good subject just to look at in detail, and particularly to see how Welsh fairies are different to British or to English fairies and to Scottish fairies, and maybe to Cornish fairies, and see what their distinct characteristics are. So that. Yeah, I've done a number like that. I did one on British pixies, and I did one on the fairies of the Isle of Man year before last, I think it was now. So it's just really concentrating on that particular area. And I also self-publish a few things. So I did just a few weeks ago, I published a book called Spirits of the Land, and that's looking at the idea of the fairies as being very, very long-standing parts of the British environment and the British view of their country and of themselves, and how they are kind of an underlying factor in the British soul, if you want to call it that, and how British people understand themselves and understand the landscape. So yeah, that's the most recent stuff I've been working on.
And so where can people go to purchase your books?
Well, the classic thing of all good bookshops. The two big books I did in the last couple of years were with Llewellyn, who are in Minnesota. Is it? I'm not sure. I think it's Minnesota. I'm not quite sure. I'm pretty sure it's Minnesota. So yeah, I mean they're Llewellyn International, and they've got a massive distribution. So those are the sorts of books that you should be easily able to pick up in shops as well as online. But yeah, you'll find those on their website, and Green Magic, of course, has got its own website, and you can order all these things through Amazon, and all my self-published stuff is done through Amazon as well. So yeah, it's only a couple of clicks away.
We'll definitely add your website, which should have links to most of your books as well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Our webpage.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was just a fascinating conversation. I feel like when I was going through your website, I was like, I could have a 4-hour conversation with this man. So I'm very glad that you joined us today. And let's see. All right, so we're going to have to wrap up today's episode of Fabric of Folklore, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. If you enjoyed today's episode, text your best friend right now and tell them to give us a listen. Word of mouth is the strongest boost for a small podcast like us. Make sure you subscribe as well, and if you have a favorite folk tale or a guest you want us to bring on, let us know. This is y'all's show. Tell us what you want to hear on our Facebook group, and until next week, thanks so much.
Thank you.